Maze in co-authoring with Daniela Peluso, right, from Virtually. I hope that you enjoy, and without any delay, we will start with talk of Nick Spears and Via Labadje, both from Chacruna Institute for Psychedelic Plant Medicines. And the title of this presentation is Indigenous Uses of Psilocybin Mushrooms and Psychedelic Capitalism. Let me know, Nick, when you are ready, and the floor is yours.
Okay, so I'll be speaking on my own for now, and then Via might jump in as a question and answer at the end. Okay, so I'm from the Institute. I'm a research coordinator and video director. So, hello?
Para la grabación, for the recording,
Sure. Okay.
Right? Be sure that you are enough close to the, yeah.
Okay. Right, so I wanted to start with this slide because this was a phrase that we came across quite a lot in the field. I originally went to the Sierra Mazateca to make a documentary about Salvia divinorum, which is endemic to the region. And we kind of barged into the field a little bit, and it was kind of a humbling lesson for me. And this was, we would often ask about Shkapastora, you know, if you know where we can find it, you know, what you think of it, then often people responded with quite, you know, blank faces or said, Shkapastora? No la conocemos. We don't know Shkapastora. And often we would trek for days in the Sierra Mazateca, which is kind of a mountainous, heavily forested area, in anticipation of meeting someone who we'd heard was like a curandero who worked with Shkapastora. And we would get there and they would say, no, we don't know it. Then we would talk a bit, and then I would ask to use the bathroom and go behind the house, and I would see, you know, banks and banks of Shkapastora everywhere. And this is interesting, and I wanted to start with this because I think it speaks to a few things which are quite important. Often it's considered very insensitive to even talk about sacred plants and fungi in the Sierra Mazateca. They're often referred to in kind of like euphemistic ways. For example, you know, mushrooms, little things that sprout from the earth. And even there's quite a controversy about Salvia divinorum and Shkapastora, because pastora is obviously a Spanish word and refers to a phenomenon that came after the colonization of Mexico. So even this, I think, might be a little bit of a euphemistic way to refer to Salvia divinorum. You know, maybe there are other ways that it's referred to. It's also considered, like most sacred substances in the Sierra Mazateca, potentially very dangerous. The word shkon is used a lot in the Sierra Mazateca to refer to something which is both sacred and dangerous. And we heard lots of stories, for example, with Salvia divinorum, because you have to observe dieta and observe sexual abstinence and avoid certain foods before consuming it. And we heard lots of stories about people actually being poisoned with Salvia divinorum. People would give it to people unwittingly. You know, they didn't know about it, and because they hadn't observed this abstinence, then they would go mad, go crazy. So yeah, so it's a very interesting theme. And it also, this kind of reaction to us represents kind of a very well-placed wariness of outsiders. You know, Mazatecs understand the dynamics of extractive capitalism well, and the effects of piracy and tourism, which they've suffered. And also, researchers and anthropologists are viewed kind of in a parallel way sometimes. We kind of have these mediator positions where we go to the Sierra and then we go out and we have like institutional and professional links. So often people would say that anthropologists and researchers are going to the Sierra to steal their knowledge and kind of take it out of the Sierra, of the local relations where it existed, and to kind of extract capital out of it in an analogous way to, you know, minerals or other plants. So today, I'm going to have to speak a bit quicker. I'm going to talk a little bit about the origins of the Mazatec shaman trope. So I'm sure we'll talk about this later, but the idea of shaman, as I'm sure you know, is a bit problematic. So we'll address that later. And I think the origin of the Mazatec trope, the shaman trope, is not just, I think it's, this is at the root of lots of our ideas and representations of shamanism throughout the Americas, which originated with lots of early texts about the Sierra Mazateca. So I'll talk a little bit about the reality of Mazatec shamanism. There's lots of double quotes here. I could double quote everything, because even the term Mazatec is often not used by people in the region to refer to themselves. So this is almost already implies kind of an outside perspective. And of course, shamanism, as we'll discuss later, is also problematic. And even the fact that we could even talk about Mazatec shamanism as a thing, as a concrete homogeneous phenomenon. And then I'll talk a little bit about an annotated bibliography we're working on with Chacruna in response to some of these problems. So I'm sure many of you are familiar with the Mazatec, and if not, I'm sure you've heard of Maria Savina. So just a little bit of context for those that don't. The Mazatec are an indigenous group who live in the Sierra Mazateca, in a very mountainous region, but also the Mazateca Baja, which is another kind of climate zone with very different geography and sometimes very different cultural practices as well. And yeah, the reason you may have probably heard of them is because they're associated with their ritualized use of psilocybin mushrooms. But there's also other sacred plants and fungi they use, Oleluki, Salvia divinorum, and others. And these are normally consumed under special circumstances, often healing an illness in veladas, which are nocturnal communal ceremonies held indoors, led by a shaman. Or in Spanish, the word most used is curandero or curandera, or the local term, well, one of them is xotexine. So here, this is an interesting map, which I've kind of adapted from a map by Gaston Guzman. And here, this light green circle is the Mazatec region. And the other circles are other indigenous groups within Mexico who contemporarily use psilocybin mushrooms. So often people find this quite surprising because the Mazatecs are kind of synonymous with psilocybin mushrooms and vice versa. But there's a huge diversity of psilocybin use within Mexico, which is often overlooked. And I think this is very important. And not just the Mazatecs are associated with psilocybin and shamanic uses, but most of the research is concentrated, is very localized in Huautla de Jimenez. And this often ignores the wider region, where there's also a diversity of different practices. So today I will be talking about the Mazatec. So I'm kind of aware that I'm reproducing this problem a little bit, but this is where I've done my research. But I hope to problematize this. So when I talk about the idea of the Mazatec shaman, this trope, these are some of the things which are associated with it. The idea that the Mazatec shaman is conformist. Sorry? Oh, okay. The idea that Mazatec shamans are conformists, they're mindlessly and passively repeating the same tradition, stretching back from ancient times, with little self-awareness or autonomy. Ideas, which hopefully we'll be problematizing throughout the talk. This idea that Mazatec shamanism is static and ahistorical. These practices are immutable and haven't changed, in the face of all the historical upheavals which the Mazatecs have gone through in Mexico and everyone else, right? The idea that Mazatec shamanism is local, the fact that it's insular and always looks inwards and doesn't concern mediation with the outside world and other historical and contemporary figures outside of the Sierra Mazateca. And the idea, this is very pernicious, that the Mazatec shaman is corruptible. The idea that once a Mazatec shaman starts talking with a researcher or a white person, someone from outside, their kind of innocence and purity is corrupted. So this very horrible paradox where people think, okay, thank you for sharing your knowledge with us. Now you're sort of contaminated by your association with the outside world. So anything you offer from now on will be kind of refracted through that kind of prism. And like I said, I would argue that lots of this is consistent with other forms of representations of indigenous groups throughout the Americas. And also I'd like us to think and talk about a little later why we kind of stubbornly hold on to this idea of the indigenous shaman, this particular trope, and why we're kind of reluctant to give it up, and how these become kind of vehicles for us to project our own fantasies on, if they're kind of, historical narratives or political ideologies. So I'm not going to go into the full history of Gordon Wasson, but I would argue that lots of these tropes originate with Wasson's first writing on Mazatec shamanism and his relationship with Maria Savina. And the problem is that these kind of texts, which have almost become canonical in like Mazatec scholarship, are still informing, they're still referenced. And these were written, in 1957. The Mazatecs, the world, everything has changed a lot since then, but they're still the go-to resource for learning about the Mazatecs. And I think some of the ideas, started with Wasson. He looked to the Mazatec shamanism as kind of like a living fossil, which was preserved since ancient times. And by looking at that, we can learn about the origins of our own religions and things like this. After Wasson released this article in Life magazine and further writing, that introduced a lot of changes to the Sierra Mazateca. There was something called what is referred to as like a hippie invasion, where lots of outsiders would come to find psilocybin mushrooms. And this has kind of left the Mazatecs with a little bit of kind of there's an anthropologist called Paja Faudre, who talks about this representational hangover. So the idea that the Mazatecs are kind of stuck with these early representations for when they speak with the outside world, or where they have a platform, they kind of feel often obliged to refer to mushrooms when normally they wouldn't, or to kind of embody this idea of the Mazatec shaman, which was established in these early texts. So what we're working on now is an annotated bibliography. And the aim of this is to offer to the reader a guide to a more diverse body of texts, to problematize these ideas, to talk about different kinds of Mazatec shamanism, the effects of psychedelic tourism, lots of texts which are more concerned with this kind of ontological turn, and decolonizing this scholarship as well, including indigenous voices who are writing about their own practices. And also, I think this can help us to kind of navigate some of the ethical quagmires that the psychedelic renaissance is in. And of course, we're kind of referring and using Mazatec shamanism and all sorts of shamanism to legitimize our practices. And we're kind of inventing this figure to do so. And this, of course, is impeding real dialogue. So what is Mazatec shamanism? So obviously, I'm not going to go too deep into this, but a Shotashine means like he, she who knows. So it's someone who has access to esoteric knowledge. And Shotashine don't just take psychoactives. They don't just take psilocybin, salvia divinorum, etc. Here in this picture, there's a man reading corn kernels, which you throw down and then you interpret the way they fall as kind of like a divinatory practice. They're involved in lots of other things like offerings, performing rites, storytelling, political and social mediation, agricultural rites, making magic bundles. And lots of these things don't immediately involve the consumption of sacred plants or fungi, but can involve a heightened state of consciousness, which we would maybe associate with the consumption of psychoactives. So even through these practices which don't involve psychoactives, there's lots of navigation of this kind of sacred geography of the region. And also veladas, even with psychoactives, are not just for healing sick people, but they can be used for sorcery, divination, even statecraft, and arguably, this is a bit contentious, but forms of cultural and political resistance. So how are we doing for time, Sidis? Okay, let's go. So the lots of the Mazatec shamanism only really makes sense when we take in like a wider focus on the Mazatec context. And one of the important ideas here is this idea of sacred topography. So a key element of Mazatec shamanism revolves around this Mazatec conception of the environment and a relational cosmology. This relational cosmology is, a key concept in Amerindian anthropology to refer to a worldview in which this binary way of looking at culture and nature doesn't exist. And the Mazatecs are aware of themselves as being seen by other non-human organisms as subjects in the same way that they view them. So in Chaustegui, an anthropologist, explained this very well. In the Mazatec context, using this term entorno enemigo, like enemy territory. So the only thing which really belongs to a Mazatec family or person is their house and their immediate garden. And everything else, all the sacred topographical features, rivers, mountains, caves, they're all owned by these entities called chicones. And this is like a pantheon. There are many chicones, and each one has a specific feature in the landscape. And it's kind of like a pantheon of, it's hard to describe, like a transmogrifying, embodied, sometimes disembodied, like Earth Lord, supernatural, I don't really like this word, but supernatural entities. And these figures have always embodied power in relation to the outside. The Mazatec in its human form is often imagined as a white person, kind of dressed in this kind of like Spanish era colonial costume. And even when I would go to, and also Chicon also means güero, like a white person. So even when I would go to kind of more remote communities, it would kind of be a bit of a joke, but lots of the kids would run away from me because they would be scared of me because they would think I was a Chicon, which is quite interesting. And there's an anthropologist called Quijada, who nicely theorizes how via this figure of the Chicon, which sometimes can be quite morally ambiguous and capricious, nature kind of manifests decisions and agency through these figures. And this is a way that Mazatecs can enter into reciprocal relations with their environment. So a leading cause of sickness is, this is kind of like the classical case of sickness, is when someone makes a transgression in this enemy environment. So they could, for example, cut down a tree without leaving an offering, entering a cave where they shouldn't enter, disturbing like the balance of human spiritual environment. And this often manifests in sickness. And the idea is that the Chicon kind of almost kidnaps the soul of that person and holds it hostage. And this is a leading cause of illness, which can manifest in like malaise, a lack of appetite, something analogous to depression maybe, which can often lead to death. So the role of the curandero in this context is that the Xotoxine, through this velada, through the use, not just, but often through the use of psychoactives, can kind of enter into dialogue with the Chicon and almost negotiate with the Chicon on behalf of the sick person to organize kind of the return of the soul of that person. And then appropriate offerings will be prepared on the basis of this negotiation, which will be left the following day, which will then lead to the patient getting better. And lots of the power and efficacy and prestige of a Xotoxine, a curandero, is their ability to skillfully travel across these highly charged borders between, the visible and the invisible world, the geography and the sacred geography. And this is not just their ability to mediate and negotiate with these Chicon, these supernatural figures, but also with within this velada, within this viaje, this trip, with other, like to mediate with other figures, historical figures from Mexico's past or contemporary figures, even psychedelic tourists. This can be implicated in the power and efficacy of a Xotoxine. So how is Mazatec shamanism changing? Well, there's lots of ways. Often before the patient, the sick person within a velada wouldn't even consume the psychoactives, the Shotashine would. So this is quite interesting, the implications of this. There's lots of, there's an anthropologist called Edward Absey, which talks a lot about the prevalence of sorcery, epidemics of sorcery, he calls it, within the Sierra Mazateca, which is now a leading cause of illness. Whereas instead of a chicon stealing your soul would be kind of kidnapped or stolen as a kind of aggressive tactic within the sorcery. So, for example, he talks about these invidia, this kind of irrational resentment that people are having, and he explains this by kind of the breakdown of traditional social relations. And when people are feeling this invidia, this envy of other people, then they often resort to employing shamans to kind of attack that person and target the person who they're feeling this invidia towards. So very briefly, the effects psychedelic tourism has had on Mazatec practices. So this phrase here, ahora hablan inglés los honguitos. This is quite a common term because the now that the psilocybin mushrooms and the velada has a more concrete a concrete monetary value, and they're kind of being removed from a lot of the social relations in which they make sense. They're saying that rather than speak Mazateco, the psilocybin mushrooms are speaking English. You know, this idea that the psilocybin mushrooms are no longer for the Mazatec people, but for the tourists. And I would argue this is kind of a quite a localized phenomenon, because you often only see psychedelic tourism in the Huautla de Jimenez and not in other regions. But especially with my research with Salvia divinorum, you found this process happening very quickly. So a plant that was so sacred, people didn't even look at it before. They avoided eye contact with the plant, came to be kind of a cash crop. So the idea of its sacredness was kind of irrevocably reconfigured by its entry into these kind of commercial exchanges. 1 minute. Okay. So just to finish, I'd just like to introduce you, if you don't know, to this Mazatec intellectual and poet, Heriberto Prado Pereda. And he writes a lot of poetry, which is very interesting, because through this poetry, in the face of this kind of objectification, commodification, fetishization of the mushrooms, he's kind of re-socializing them, turning them back from these things, objects, into subjective entities through very different textual strategies. For example, by invoking them as interlocutors rather than as things. And he's using text in a very different way as Wasson, for example, who would use text to describe a practice, whereas Heriberto Prado is using text to speak with and inform how we can address these substances, these sacred plants, as subjects that we can relate with. And just very quickly, there's also a very interesting anthropologist, Kathleen Harrison, who addresses how the Mazatec nomenclature, the names of the things they give to different animals and plants, reflects associations with other species or natural processes. So within the name of something, it will refer to another species. So this is a really interesting way that language is used in a similar way, which allows for kind of an intimate human role in a diverse and self-aware system of ecological interdependence. So yeah, I'm sorry to rush, and yeah, thank you.
Much, Nick and Bia, for this insightful presentation. Now we will move forward with the talk of Timothy, which will be really useful to get an overview, a general overview of the cultural context in the Sierra Mazateca. And he will share with us his talk entitled The Discovery, Exploration, and Cultural Transformations of Salvia divinorum. Timothy, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. And I'm pleasantly surprised to find other people who've like looked into Salvia divinorum, because I was like, I might be the only person talking about this, and I'm glad someone else I'm also very curious to share notes because I think you've been to parts of the Sierra that I have not been to. I'm going to be streaming this so my mom can watch. So, okay. So this, checking my connection. You know, I'm now live. Okay, great. So, hi, my name is Timmy. I'm a PhD student in history program at UT Austin. This paper that I'm presenting today examines a mint plant, which was addressed in Nick Spear's presentation from the Sierra Mazateca called Ska Chonchitjon in Mazatec, or more frequently Ska pastora locally. It received its binomial name, Salvia divinorum, in 1962 from University of California botanist Carl Epling. The Sierra Mazateca appears frequently in literature on psychedelics, as was just addressed, but the narratives largely center around R. Gordon Wasson and Valentina Pavlovna Wasson's expeditions in the 1950s, and R. Gordon Wasson's now notorious 1957 Life magazine article. Within the English language literature, it relies heavily on Wasson's account in the book Huautla Tiempo de Hippies by Alvaro Estrada, the son of a former municipal president. And this renders the deeper history of the Sierra Mazateca somewhat blurry. It ends up treating the economic hub city and the historic regional capital of Huautla de Jimenez, along with the perspectives of its inhabitants, as metonyms for the region as a whole. Through my research, I'm hoping to contribute to a more nuanced understanding of the history of the search for visionary plants in the Sierra that can connect it to the political, economic, and environmental context. In 1961 and 62, R. Gordon Wasson, who at this point was still grieving the death of his wife in 1958, arrived in San Bartolomé Yautla, a city 8 hours east of Huautla by foot, pictured on the screen. There's now a road there, but it is 8 hours by foot. I don't know I think it was like about a 3-hour drive, via private airstrip to seek out the then unidentified mint plant. Though in his field notes from these trips, Wasson criticized pejorative views of indigenous people, and he did see his own work as a noble effort to salvage a tradition otherwise destined to disappear. His reliance on local elites, and the destined to disappear is sort of what he saw, I mean to say, his reliance on local elites, on development workers and government officials, meant that even as he praised indigenous customs, he nonetheless replicated colonial framings that constructed indigenous people as others, foils to the modern West. As the active ingredient to the newly dubbed Salvia divinorum became identified as one of the most potent naturally occurring psychedelic molecules ever discovered, Wasson's research laid the groundwork for the plant to become commodified, approached as a method for accessing an internal frontier, approached through many of the same mechanisms as the frontiers of settler colonialism in the United States and in northern Mexico. I can try to I'm sorry. So after providing historical context and overview of the plant's ecology and pharmacology, I'm also take off my mask. I focus on the period between the start of Wasson's interest in the plant in 1960 and the identification of its mechanism of action in 2002. I emphasize how the post-World War II interest in researching and experimenting with visionary plants replicated many of the patterns of ecological colonialism, as described by Indigenous scholars Kyle Powys-White and Caitlin Reed. The paper utilizes a combination of archival material from the Sierra, Mexico City, and the Harvard Botanical Museum, oral history collected over the last year, anthropological studies by other authors, and information from the life sciences, especially pharmacology, which is the only field in the sciences which I have training. To tie all this together, my interpretive framework draws from biosemiotics, new materialism, settler colonial, and critical indigenous studies. So moving to historical context, prior to the formation of a hierarchical Mazatec dynasty in 800 CE, the limestone and shale mountains of the Sierra Mazateca were inhabited by mobile, decentralized bands who likely did not identify as a discrete ethnic group. The region's caves, deepest in the Western Hemisphere, received visits from neighboring Zapotec, Olmec, and Mixtec priests. In 1350, the Mexica Triple Alliance made the Mazatec into tributaries, applying the pejorative term Mazatec, or deer people, to them. Most people that I've met, at least in the region, tend to use, and some of them do take pride in the term Mazatec. The predominant autonym was at one point Ha-Shuta Enima, or people who work on the mountain. The Mazatec allied with the Spanish during the 1519-21 invasion, and under the Spanish crown, the local nobility retained a significant amount of autonomy due to the difficult conditions for travel in the region, and continued to retain significant influence even after the abolition of the nobility in 1857. Shortly after that point, Mazatec farmers began planting coffee, and in the case of Ayutla, the region even attracted foreign settlers. Inequality between hub cities like Huautla, with relatively privileged populations of bilingual intermediaries, and other communities mounted into the 20th century, boiling over into intense fighting during the Mexican Revolution between the Carrancistas, concentrated in Huautla, and Magonistas and Zapatistas based in San Mateo, Yolaxochitlan, and San Antonio, Alaxochitlan. In the years after the revolution, the federal government sought greater authority over the rebellious region through assimilationist programs spearheaded by the Instituto Nacional Indigenista. Such projects sought to encourage more identification with the national culture among indigenous people. To construct a need for such intervention, I rhetoric presented the region as isolated, a sentiment that Wasson, who corresponded extensively with anthropologists involved with the INI's mission, echoed in his work, as he was always conscious of his status as an amateur and willing to defer to institutional experts. Yet the word autonomous describes the situation better than isolated. Small Mazatec enclaves had already started to form in places like Tehuacan, Puebla, or Oaxaca City by the time that Wasson arrived, and Mazatec people worked as braceros to meet the U.S. demand for farm workers during World War II. So now moving to the plant. As the Mexican state sought to reduce Mazatec autonomy, missionaries with the Summer Linguistics Institute and anthropologists from Mexican research institutions visiting in the 1930s and 40s started to visit the once largely autonomous region and took note of its psychoactive plants. Though more attention had been paid at this point to psilocybin-containing mushrooms, teonanacatl, and morning glory seeds, ololiki, several anthropologists had briefly made note of a psychoactive mint plant referred to by the name hoja de la pastora, leaf of the shepherdess. This syncretic name represented an adaptation of the name ska ton chichon, or leaf of the female guide. Both names refer to its ability to act as a guide towards water, which helped mark it as significant to pre-Hispanic naturalists, often members of a priestly nobility, whose political authority was wound up in controlling the distribution of water for large-scale agriculture in an increasingly drought-prone region, referring to Mesoamerica as a whole. The plant also marked itself as significant through the mixture of diterpenoids it produces in small glandular trichromes on its leaves, one of which, called salvinorin A, binds to the kappa opioid receptor. This is a protein structure sensitive to large neuropeptides released from dense core vesicles in the neurons. They diffuse through volume transmissions. What's significant about that is that they act slower than smaller molecule transmitters like glutamate or serotonin. A similar structure to the kappa opioid receptor modulates reproductive development in insects. Producing salvinorin A in varying amounts over the course of the year enables the plant, which rarely flowers or produces seed, to reproduce by vegetative cloning. In humans, the effects of this compound depend heavily on the mode of ingestion. Today, Mazatec curanderos take the plant in aqueous infusions or apply it to the skin with alcohol, gradually developing a relationship with the plant and learning to, quote, speak the voice of the leaf, close quote. However, since 1998, smokable forms have been sold in head shops in the United States and the Netherlands. Debates in online communities, nowadays devoted to experimenting informally with the plant in areas where it is legal, tend to revolve around the correct mode of ingestion, whether to smoke the plant, understood within the online community to violate Mazatec norms, or to attempt to follow traditional methods. On its own, salvinorin A represents one of the most potent psychoactive molecules ever discovered in the natural world, being active on the microgram level, yet what are understood to be traditional methods of consumption require a great deal of patience and often do not produce the kind of immediate effects that smokers desire. So moving to, and we'll now break this into planks with discovery, like following what it says in the title. So the binary opposition between smoking or using traditional methods constrains the discussion to avoid more thorny questions that may, in the words of one poster to the subreddit, rsalvia, artificially, quote, limit the exploration of consciousness, close quote. The promise of discovery, a key meta-narrative device for the expansion of colonial frontiers, helps to legitimate the right of non-Mazatec people to explore this indigenous space. As European colonial projects have valorized knowledge encoded in text over that circulated in speech, assembling and inscribing indigenous scientific knowledge, generally preserved in more speech-like and dynamic forms, though Mesoamericans had developed systems of writing, allows foreign botanists to claim to have, quote, discovered visionary plants used by indigenous people like the Mazatec for thousands of years prior. Indeed, as the father of Western botany, Carl Linnaeus, devised his system of binomial nomenclature, he intended for the right to assign a printed name to a plant to bestow glory upon a discovering botanist. Yet this naming process also enables the erasure of the local intermediaries on whom most collecting projects depend. To locate specimens of hojas de la pastora, R. Gordon Wasson initially reached out to Mazatec schoolteacher Erlinda Martinez Cid in 1960, a relative of former municipal president Aurelio Carrera, who later served as a translator for him and helped connect him to curanderos and other local informants as he looked for the plant. As mentioned previously, his travel in 1961 and 62 was facilitated by the owners of a private airstrip at Plan Carlota outside Ayautla. Though Wasson preferred the name Salvia mazatecorum for the plant, Carl C. Epling and translator Carlos Hativa, as well as Richard Evan Schultes, Wasson's mentor, all preferred the name Salvia divinorum, or Sage of the Diviners, which left open the possibility of the plant's use outside of the Sierra. From the 1962 publication of the plant's name onward to the 2000s, however, the plant's mechanism of action remained unclear. In 1982 and 1983, chemists in Mexico and Michigan independently isolated salvinorin A from the plant's leaves, but it was not confirmed as the active ingredient until 1993, when Californian psychonaut Daniel Siebert discovered its activity by extracting and smoking salvinorin A. Before Siebert had even published his findings in the Journal of Ethnopharmacology, psychedelic anti-guru Terence McKenna had started to praise Siebert's discovery on his lecture tours, pointing to the plant's alleged lack of an indigenous name as evidence of its radical newness, and suggesting that its careful exploration by non-indigenous psychonauts promised to, quote, redeem the entire enterprise, close quote, of psychedelic exploration. By the time of McKenna's speech, psychedelic exploration had only just started to regain its scientific credibility, but still relied on the efforts of amateurs like Siebert, who often aligned themselves with the counterculture, suggesting some sense of anti-establishment feeling. However, when Wasson first arrived in the Sierra in search of what he dubbed, quote, magic mushrooms, close quote, in 1953, the designation of inner space as a frontier for exploration represented the concern of hemispheric national security and pharmaceutical institutions. Beyond these fears, which seem hysterical in hindsight of the Soviets' alleged prowess in brainwashing, the desire to explore and master inner space reflected Cold War anxieties over ideological and national loyalties. Communist and capitalist blocs sought to assert sovereignty over the geopolitical space of the mind, a space constituted by still undocumented protein structures, ion channels, and electromagnetic gradients, which the language of mechanistic Western science had historically treated as divorced from the material world altogether. This contest over the mind was reflected in the efforts of the Indigenista Development Project to extend authority over the Sierra Mazateca, a region that had proven, as I mentioned before, historically rebellious during the Mexican Revolution. Development planners envisioned that development would drive out what they called unhygienic practices of curanderos. Yet at the same time, the global search for new medicinal and psychoactive chemicals empowered by advancements in organic chemistry led development planners to encourage anthropologists to document the scientific knowledge of curanderos before its inevitable distinction. Making stops at the local headquarters of the Instituto Nacional Indigenista during both of his expeditions hunting for Ska Pastora, Wasson internalized this meta-narrative and utilized it in his work to justify what he acknowledged to be violations of local boundaries. Having lost both his parents, his brother, and his wife over the last decade and a half, and it's worth mentioning that his father was a preacher and his brother was a missionary, he remained convinced that the use of visionary substances represented the prehistoric roots of human spiritual experience, and felt determined to salvage and recover this sacred tradition regardless of the costs. Yet this entailed accepting an assumption that people described as primitive by anthropologists represented, in his words, museum pieces, a framing that accepted the colonial view of the global indigenous population as foils for modern man capable of demonstrating primordial human nature. The name Salvia divinorum, supported by Epling and Wasson's mentor Schultes for its generality, enabled sellers of the plant to refer vaguely to the plant as something used by, quote, Mexican shamans. Terence McKenna actually referred, when he was introducing it to a crowd in 1994, referred to the people who used it as the Mixtec completely, and also called it Ojos de la Pastora, and also invites users to understand the Mazatec as an ancient people distant from the everyday lives of users in places like the United States, rather than a people who not only continue to exist, but who may very well perform service or agricultural labor in their own countries as migrant workers. Though Wasson despised the use of indigenous visionary plants by the counterculture, his reasoning proved especially appealing to generations of restless youth in search of a way to rebel against the material conditions of industrial capitalism. Exploring the inner frontier through Salvia divinorum and other psychedelics seemed to offer contact with a purer mode of human experience, apparently untainted by modern life. Yet as a meta-narrative device, the frontier has long served as a way for the settler colonial state to channel the potential for subversion towards uncharted spaces where the norms of ethical behavior and legality in the heavily policed metropole do not apply. This pattern is suggested in the so-called psychedelic renaissance, where institutional researchers take pains to distance themselves from the counterculture, though much of their work builds off of prior decades of countercultural experimentation. The exploration of salvative norm exemplifies the historic overlap between institutional and non-institutional spheres. By 2002, Daniel Siebert had collaborated with pharmacologist Brian Roth to confirm the activity of salvinorin A at the kappa opioid receptor. This enabled the detailed mapping of this receptor with radioligands as pharmacologists and neuroscientists mined the trip reports of amateur psychonauts to generate new theories about the role of the receptor in consciousness. Am I good on time, by the way? Do I have about enough time, or should I? 4 minutes? One, okay. I'll try to get through this I'll skip over a few things in this last paragraph. So regardless of stated intentions, then, the adherence to the foundational assumptions of settler colonial capitalism enables the hegemon to channel frontier activities towards the inscription of an ecological order that understands humanity as an exceptional species exerting dominion over the natural world. Though Terence McKenna warned against allowing salviative norm to become commodified in his 1994 lectures heralding Siebert's discovery, extract-enhanced forms of the plant, dependent on resource-intensive greenhouse cultivation and industrial manipulation, entered head shops in the Netherlands, the UK, and the United States by 1998, as Details magazine touted the plant as the new ecstasy. Its entry into the global market not only intended to strip the plant of its identity as a living conscious agent engaged in reciprocal relationships with humankind, but attempted to reconfigure it as a simple recreational commodity. Within the Sierra Mazateca, merchants began selling the plant to tourists, hippies, and foreign businessmen. Daniel Siebert offered 1 gram of extract-enhanced salvia divinorum on his website for the equivalent of 30% of the average monthly salary of a Mexican worker in 2000, yet called merchants who sold plants to outsiders unscrupulous. However, I would argue that the reality goes deeper than simple questions of individual choices to participate in a market, and instead represents the outgrowth of decades of developmentalist projects intent on assimilating the Mazatec and other indigenous peoples into the Mexican nation state and the global capitalist order. So I'm going to skip ahead to the conclusion, and I'll just sort of to summarize, because I know I'm running low on time. From its ecological niche in highland ravines in the Sierra Mazateca, where it manipulates the life cycles of insect populations and guides travelers towards water, to its interactions with non-indigenous users outside the region, Shkaton Chitjon exerts agency over the boundaries constructed by various organisms between their bodies and the surrounding environment. As the settler colonial establishment sought to establish sovereignty over a national psyche politic, the pharmacological register of conscious experience represented a key governmental concern. Settler colonial capitalism treats the inner space unlocked by salvia divinorum as a frontier whose exploration, even when apparently subversive, nonetheless feeds into the inscription of mechanistic ecologies onto indigenous territories. Operating through Paul Gutenberg in the keynote address at this conference called An Orientalized Fascination with Indigenous Psychoactive Plants, even sympathetic researchers have often viewed indigenous people as homogeneous, static vessels of ancient knowledge in the discovery and exploration of visionary plants. Acceptance of such foundational colonial framings allows the apparent subversion of amateur experimentation with salvia divinorum to be channeled towards the interests of colonial metropoles. The questions in online communities about whether or not one should use the plant in traditional ways or smoke it in a violation of indigenous norms matter less than larger structural questions about its commodification. The demonstration of respect may assuage settler anxieties, but does not matter if not accompanied by solidarity with indigenous political demands in the present. And to conclude on that, I'll just mention just these things are examples of some of the contemporary Mazatec political concerns that I've noticed. And while talking to people from there, one of my friends who's actually from there, Celeste Flores Cuevas, wrote a wonderful MA thesis called Rostros de Agua en la Sierra Mazateca about the privatization of water infrastructure and commonly held lands there. There are also concerns about the survival of the Mazatec language and the way that language is used as a criterion for counting as indigenous. There is political repression against leftist activists in places like San Antonio Oaxaca, which is the birthplace of anarcho-communist revolutionary Ricardo Flores Magón, who is being celebrated all over Mexico City this year, from what I understand. And also the treatment of migrant workers from the Sierra Mazateca and other indigenous areas of Mexico and the United States and Canada. So that's the conclusion. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Timothy, for your talk. Making a brief summary in order to move forward, we have to point out the significance to take into account the concept, decolonize the concept, frameworks, narrative, and practices. Also, the importance of language, privatization of natural resources, political activism, repression, migration, and so on. There are some of the topics that you put on the table. And of course, in the Q&A time, we will have the opportunity to go deeper on this issue. Now, I want to welcome to Patrick Chassé from the University of Saskatchewan. He will join us virtually with a talk also related with this topic. The title of his talk is Uprooted, Psilocybin as Synthetic Trip or Natural Experience. Patrick, are you here? Are you there?
All right. Can somebody technical?
Ah,
¿Puede alguien con sabiduría técnica nos ayuda?
What's
con
happened?
Zoom.
En la cabina, sí.
What's happened?
We have
Patrick?
somebody who.
Patrick
We
is
have
online.
Oh, he is?
Yeah.
Yeah, Patrick's online.
Okay. I just didn't see him.
Patrick, how are you?
Hi, how you doing?
Oh. Sorry.
Can everybody hear me?
Yes,
Yes,
we
okay.
can hear you, but we can see you.
You
Wait
can't see me?
a minute
Sure, no problem.
in order to solve this digital witchcraft. Okay, we have your PowerPoint presentation on the screen.
Perfect, that's
And
great.
please, okay, let us know if you are there.
Yeah,
right?
absolutely. Yep. No, we're
Okay,
good to go.
Patrick, the floor is yours.
Perfect. So before I give my presentation, I'd like to say thank you. I wish I could be there in person. It sounds like it's a wonderful conference, and just sitting in on some panels earlier, just fantastic information.
Please, if you can talk a little bit louder
Sure.
or
Yeah.
close to the microphone in order to get a better sound for the recording and for the audience that are here in the auditorium, please.
Sure. Is that better? Oh, see it is?
Yeah, it's better.
It's better? Okay. All right. I also wanted to acknowledge that as we gather here today, you in Mexico and myself in Saskatchewan, I will acknowledge that I'm on Treaty 6 territory, the homeland of the Métis. I just want to, express my thankfulness for that and my dedication to continuing to work on relationships here as I present on these issues, which I think you'll see very shortly are related.
Patrick, sorry, a little bit louder, please. Sorry
Okay.
to annoying you, but a little bit louder, yes.
Sure, no problem.
No problem.
How's that? Is that better?
Perhaps closer.
I can't go any closer. The microphone is in my mouth at this moment, so.
Okay, move forward. Be noisy.
I will see if I can boost the microphone gain.
Okay.
How is that? Is that better?
A little bit your volume, perhaps check your volume.
Yeah, I've turned the volume up entirely to the top, so I can't do much else.
Okay. Okay, let's move forward and keep talking in order that the technician adjusts the volume, right? Let's go. Patrick,
Great.
the floor is yours.
Great, thank you so much. I'd like to speak to you a little bit about what I think is sort of a new, for me, frontier, maybe not the right word, avenue of research, which is this sort of notion of agroecology, but agroecology looking at psychedelics, in this case, mushrooms. And so the key question that's kind of fascinated me as I've started doing my research, moving from what I know in Guatemala to engaging with, the idea of mushrooms or psychedelics or psilocybin in medical treatment, is this artificial, I think, distinction which is made between synthetic treatment or natural trip. And so we see here in Canada, actually, we have quite a few of the pharmaceutical companies are based here in Toronto, like Cybin or Compass Pathways. And so they're working on this way to distill sort of the essential ingredient, psilocybin, into a pill form, which you can use for treatment or for end-of-life treatment, depression, anxiety, etc. And so it's given rise, I think, to an interesting debate about whether or not that synthetic experience is going to be a natural trip, if it's going to have that sort of same, maybe quasi-spiritual element to it, or if there's just other associated chemicals that are being missed in the process. So really questioning how natural or how the synthetic trip, its value. My kind of like thinking here is to look at how we need to really think, I think, carefully about what we mean by the more natural trip, because I don't think that just ingesting mushrooms makes it quote unquote a natural trip. And I like to look here at the example of Guatemala, and specifically the Fungi Academy, which is located in Lago Atitlan. And I'll talk a little bit more about the context and give you a sense of what the location is like and some of the environmental problems that may be accompanying this influx of psychedelic tourism. So just as a starting point and mirroring what was already been said in earlier presentations, we have, the notion that in Guatemala, like Mexico, there's a strong sort of pre-colonial use of mushrooms for psychedelic hallucinogenic purposes. And so you have these mushroom stones, which are often represented as sort of this pre-Columbian culture of psychedelic medicine or psychedelic mushroom use. We also have, I think, interestingly, a kind of absence of evidence on the ground, which could be related to what was presented in the first presentation, where people are reticent to talk about psychedelics, and I'll mention that a bit later. We have here Bernard Lowy, did a sort of exhaustive search for psilocybin mexicana in 1970s in Guatemala, and he had trouble finding it. And it turns up, this picture here is of a market, which is just 25 kilometers south of Guatemala City, where there's been a thriving trade in psilocybin mexicana for a long time. But his general point of his article was really like, there's not as much presence here of psychedelic mushrooms as you would kind of assume based on this older cultural experience. Also, as we'll talk about in a few minutes, the abundance of Amanita muscaria, but then it's not always very commonly used. So what's going on here? And I think before I leave that slide, the kind of sense really is to kind of think about how I think, again, echoing earlier presentations, we need to be really careful about not fixing Indigenous peoples in time and place, right? Things that may have happened earlier do not necessarily reflect an evolution of Indigenous culture the same way that, my ancestors may have believed, I'm Scottish and French, in the second site, but it doesn't mean that I myself, believe in that going forward, right? We're allowed to evolve, change, adapt, and move forward while still retaining aspects of our identity. So the setting that I want to talk about here today is Lago Atitlan. So you see a map here of the lake. It's surrounded by 3 volcanoes. And so Aldous Huxley, who spent quite a bit of time here, said, it's Lake Como with the additional embellishment of several immense volcanoes. That's to say it's quite a spectacular place, which has a lot of spiritual resonance for both Indigenous peoples who live there, mostly Cachiquel and Sutihil, who live along the lake, but also a lot of foreigners have come there and been sort of struck by the majesty of the location. Another sort of contemporary reference that maybe you're familiar with, if anybody's familiar with The Little Prince, the author of The Little Prince was actually had a plane crash in Guatemala, and he had to rest up in Antigua, which is the sort of old colonial capital, and would often go to Lago Atitlan. And this is a mountain called Cerro de Oro, which I actually worked on a coffee cooperative or assisted coffee cooperative right on the banks there for quite a long time. But it allegedly was the inspiration for the boa constrictor that consumed the elephant, which is sort of the beginning passages of The Little Prince. And again, I mentioned this, 1, because it's kind of amusing, but 2, because it gives us a sense of the spiritual sort of imaginative nature of the lake and how it has inspired generations of humans of all cultures to kind of think spiritually about the lake's location and its power. So we have Lago Atitlan, which is this fantastical setting, and we have some of the communities along the lake. Panajachel is a famous tourist town, quite busy, very sort of rough in the sense that there's lots of backpackers and hotels and hostels. It's very busy. But you also have smaller communities, specifically San Marcos de la Laguna, which is this small community which has kind of struck itself or set itself up in the mold of being a yoga, spiritual retreat center where people come to escape from the wider world. And in this town, there's an organization called the Fungi Academy, which has quite a notable online presence as well, with Instagram accounts and online courses you can take. That was created a few years ago. And the idea of the Fungi Academy is really to drive home this notion that there's an alliance between human and fungi that inspires us to live in balance with each other and our environment. And you can see pictured here one of the people who run the organization at this current moment in time. So I think implicit in the assumption here is that the Fungi Academy and the sort of the growth of mushrooms in this region is constructed around a notion of environmental sustainability. And I would suggest that if you look at mushrooms just as in terms of, you know, the ecological impact that they have as a food being grown or as a functional food being grown or as a medicine, that it's fairly low, you know, that they grow on the forest floor or they often grow in situations where they don't require a whole lot of external inputs, you know, fertilizers, pesticides, all those things we typically associate with the growth of crops. They don't require a lot of that. They're actually quite good at growing and have low impact, low water use, generally speaking. And so have been sold as this environmentally friendly alternative, you know, this medicine that is both spiritual, but also can help you connect to the earth in a way that you can keep your conscience clean because you're not, you know, engaging with, the international transshipments of cocaine, for example, that run through Guatemala as well as Mexico, or other sort of altering drugs, mind-altering drugs. And I think as we kind of like situate the Fungi Academy, you know, and they offer a whole series of guides about how to do a psychedelic work and how to grow mushrooms in that regard, also pay attention to where the impulses or where the influences are coming from, right? So, you know, Michael Pollan being quoted here in one of the more recent Instagram posts. And I think just a kind of fascinating comment from the creative director, which I posted partly because it's perplexing to me, if I'm being honest. But, you know, he imagines the experience of having one of these mushrooms as a wise man sneaking up and chloroforming a stressed out dictator, allowing for a moment of freedom in the mind, and this mystic healing experiences may arise. So there's sense that, you know, psychedelics really have this powerful influence, but also largely, I think, in the context and the setting and the images that are presented, we'll see more in a moment, that while we may be rooted in a sort of a lake with a rich indigenous heritage, right, Lago Atitlan, the references that are being made to it are cursory. We'll see in a moment, you know, sort of what I mean here, but it's like we are connecting to nature, but we are doing so by bypassing all the people who have lived here for generations. And certainly in their wider literature, they do talk about local Mayan communities and their connection to those communities, but it can't help but feel a little bit cursory. And the founder of the organization, who unfortunately lost his life on Christmas Day in 2020, he spoke quite at length on a podcast, Fungi. I think it's Fungi. I can't remember the last name of the podcast, but he basically talked about his life journey into creating this organization. And he said, you know, like part of what he had done was to travel through southern Mexico and Guatemala with nothing, him and a friend, right? They eschewed all over the worldly belongings because they wanted to test people's, you know, what is humanity's like instinct? Is it to help people or ignore people? And I think personally, I can think from one side of things, that's admirable, right? The dedication to living aesthetic and sort of giving up a lot of what you would consider the trappings of life. On the other hand, I think there's an element of privilege, which is important to stress, which characterizes a lot of the things that are happening in San Marcos or these other sort of psychedelic tourist communities, where people have the privilege of disengaging, right? They have the privilege of surrendering their worldly goods, and they take advantage in a sense, you know, that their spiritual development comes at the expense, the material expense of families and communities who have very little in most contexts, but are willing to give to others because they, at least in my personal experience living in rural Guatemala doing work and research, because they know what poverty feels like, right? So there's a sense of generosity born of a sort of shared experience, except for one party is choosing the experience and the other party is, you know, structurally bound up in that. So as I said, Lago Atitlan is sold as this place for retreat and connection. And I think that the race and gender dynamics here, or race especially, I should say, are quite evident in this image here, where you see largely white Western people presented, you know, and this kind of fantastical image of this DJ playing in front of the volcano. And I don't want to be a hypocrite. Like, if I was there, I'd probably be dancing. It looks like fun, right? But we think, again, it's sort of the example of the mushroom, because if you think about these things in a larger structural context, it starts to be a little problematic. That we don't necessarily have to judge people's choice of, you know, where they decide to go and retreat or get away from things. But I think we probably need to emphasize a little bit about the potential consequences for that they may not realize in their goodwill effort to kind of get out and sort of stretch their spiritual muscles, so to speak, and maybe kind of experiment with different ways of living and being. On the right-hand side, at least right-hand for myself, we see an image here from just June 14th, so just recently, of a full night gathering at the Starry Mountain. And I think this is really interesting because it brought out some of the themes that I'm going to talk about in a minute in terms of what are the larger consequences of this Western spiritual engagement with Lago Atitlan, this psychedelic tourism, this sort of new age movement. So you have the Facebook post. I'm going to blame all this Instagram and Facebook stuff on my digital humanities colleagues who have been influencing me unduly these days. So I apologize for people who are put off by these non-traditional historical sources. But Rebecca Quiaquén, who lives in a barrio of San Pedro de la Laguna, and important to know that a lot of the businesses in San Pedro are closer to the shore, but a lot of the houses of locals and community members have been driven up the mountain on steeper and steeper slopes to make way for the tourism, right? So the tourists get the best land, and the communities that service those tourists, as people working in restaurants or people working in hotels, etc., they're the ones who are pushed into precarious locations. So she's complaining here in her Facebook post, and to be important about her, she actually works as a youth coordinator with a local organization doing outreach for Indigenous youth and educational work. She said, how is it possible that it's midnight already and we can't sleep with this huge noise? Please, those who are doing this kind of event, it's really already a nuisance. And then I've highlighted in Spanish, and then I'll read it in English. Plus, it's been raining for a long time, and we need to be aware of the risks here in Neighborhood 1. But how? If we can't even chill with that bulb. Be aware, please. So obviously she's complaining about the noise, right? And had a YouTube video ready to go, which can show you the whole celebration last night. Somebody kindly recorded it. But I think it's really important to emphasize her concern about the natural environment. Why is that coming out in a posting, which ostensibly is really about noise and sort of a lot of the comments talk about how, like, you know, they're probably high or they're probably intoxicated or they're on some sort of substance. So there's a lot of sort of assumptions within the community of San Pedro. This is a public Facebook page where this was taken from, about what people are up to in these communities. A lot of, you know, undercurrents of distrust, which I've observed in other parts of Guatemala, often manifested from a lack of communication between different communities. So when we think about Lago Atitlan, I think we need to think about it as sort of an unstable oasis. And so we have this quote here from Margaret Dix from Del Valle University. It said, every year, 1 million cubic meters of untreated raw sewage enters the lake. And 110,000, anyway, a large number of metric tons of soil is lost due to erosion. Clearly math, not my strong suit. And we see here at the image on the side, this is actually a screen grab from the local news, which is showing you the damages wrought by a landslide that rolled right through one of those precarious communities I told you about in San Pedro La Laguna, which is to say that there's two things happening here, which I'll talk about. One is deforestation, sort of being intensified by pressures put on communities by tourism. So that's pushing people further up the slopes, which is causing more land to be cleared for agriculture and for houses to feed those kind of tourist communities, but also to, like, engage in subsistence. The second is that the lake itself is unique in the sense that it's quite deep and it has no natural outflow that we know of. Well, clearly, there must be some way where the water is leaving, but it's somewhere around 340 meters deep, if not deeper, because it's very difficult to measure the depth of the lake. And I'll show you images here in a few minutes of some of the consequences. But as we think about this inundation, landslide, and the precarious communities, this is the historical piece for me. It fits in with my research that I've been doing for my book about deforestation in the area since the 1940s, if not earlier, right? So the government in the 1940s, so 1944 to 54 was a revolutionary government in Guatemala, and they tried to do a lot of modernization initiatives, especially focusing on environmental change. And lamentably, they identified indigenous peoples as a cause of a lot of environmental destruction. In retrospect, it turns out that wasn't quite accurate, but that's the topic I get into in my larger research project. So you can see the caption here is que no se repita el caso de Panajachel, right? Panajachel is the large tourist town, which is the entry point to Lago Atitlan. And it's showing you here that upland deforestation has led to this massive landslide, which has swept through the entire community. So that's that current of water sweeping through here, which is this uncontrollable inundation. And the reality is that, Lago Atitlan is at special risk of this, and there have been multiple large landslides through Hurricane Stan, through Hurricane Agatha, and more recent hurricanes caused by this mix of intense tropical storms combined with soil that is sort of loosely attached because of the pressures of deforestation, of increased urbanization, of growth of communities as they kind of grow and expand to feed tourism and tourist communities in the area. And so, like I said, one of the problems with Lago Atitlan, and this is a NASA image to the right-hand side, and this is an image here taken from somebody kind of going through the lake itself, and I've actually seen this firsthand. These are algae blooms you can see from space. So essentially what's happening is all that wastewater and all that eroded soil is flooding into the volcanic lake, but because it has no outlet, it's causing two problems. One is these algae blooms as the level of oxygen is going down considerably in the water, which is also leading to mass fish die-offs, which is affecting fishermen who are pictured in the image here. And that's fishing is one of the major sources of livelihood in this area. But it's also leading to a continual rise in sea levels, which is another sort of form of displacement where people are being pushed further up slopes, with the sea level having risen almost 18 feet in the last 10 years. And there are variable fluctuations depending on water levels, but still, because of this unique sort of formation as a volcanic lake crater, basically, it has different dynamics than a regular lake. So as we kind of think about, we've set the context, we've looked at sort of the organization, the Fungi Academy, and their goals and aspirations.
Sorry to interrupt you. You have 3 minutes more.
Sure. Yeah, I'm almost done. Then the question I have really is, where are the Kachkel and Tzotzil voices, right? These are the two major indigenous communities that live on the lake. And I don't see them reflected in the Fungi Academy's work, except for in an incidental way. And certainly there are, shamans in Guatemala. And so there's a picture here of two of them here. And many of them kind of eschew the mushroom as the kind of major form of spiritual medicine, partly because I think there is, as was referenced in an earlier presentation, some sensitivity about the legality of it and some sensitivity about external sort of attempts to gather knowledge. There's been a parade of anthropologists through Guatemala. But there's also a sense where there are other plants. There are other sort of plants that have medicinal value. Cacao was born essentially in Guatemala, on the coast, the Pacific coast of Guatemala, and it itself has a rich sort of heritage. So when we think about, these plants with spiritual connections, perhaps we do well also to cast the net a little bit wider, to think a little more broadly about what potentially could be at heart. So as I finish up here, I will say mushrooms are consumed in Guatemala in huge quantities, as indicated by the image at the beginning of the presentation with those two kids. It's just that most of the mushrooms that are consumed for their taste, not necessarily, or functional, other sort of health virtues, not necessarily hallucinogenic values. So a 2018 study that was an ethno-botanical study of mushrooms in Guatemala found just outside of Guatemala City, a huge abundance of mushrooms, except for the fact that almost nobody would go on record speaking about hallucinogenic mushrooms. So mushrooms exist, they just do so in a much lower quantity. And as we think about ending this presentation, it's kind of, I think, important that same, where this picture was taken from here, the major threat to that community, which is the major mushroom market for Guatemala, which is San Juan Zacatepec, is actually industry. So we have double pressures here. We have one industry pressure coming from tourism, from tourists who are coming in and sort of consuming local resources and putting pressure on local landscapes in their search for a psychedelic trip. And then we also have a real and actual thriving mushroom local market, which is itself being threatened by rapid and expansive deforestation in the name of quote unquote industrialization. And so as I end there, that's really sort of my first foray into what I think would be really interesting agroecological history of psychedelics, which are essentially a plant and potentially a crop, but they don't follow the normal rules in sense of like, cotton or sugar or bananas in terms of their environmental impact. And I would love to hear more from people here, and I'm looking forward to the next presentation. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you very much, Patrick, for your presentation. And before to move with the last talk, I only want to highlight 4 points that Patrick addressed in his talk in order to invite the reflection about it. For example, the dualism between synthetic and natural, the trivialization of psychedelic experience, and also the paradox embedded in the idea or in the tourist practice that are based, for example, in the need to satisfy a spiritual need, and paradoxically, in the satisfaction of these spiritual needs, we are destroying the environment, as Patrick clearly mentioned with the example of the Lago Atitlan. Well, with any other delay, I will give you the floor to Joseph Mays and Daniela Peluso, who will share with us the talk entitled Decolonizing Philanthropy and Indigenous Reciprocity by Supporting the Autonomy of Local Community. Joseph, please.
Thank you. Just not sure if one of the wizards in the back can make my slides appear. Well, I'll go ahead.
The presentation?
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay. Thank you, Osiris. Thank you, everyone, for being here. My name is Joseph Mays. I am the program director of the Indigenous Reciprocity Initiative of the Americas for the Chacruna Institute for Psychedelic Plant Medicines. And I'm an ethnobotanist. I have been doing ethnographic and ecological work for about 15 years now, and I've found that those two pursuits are really one. Biological and cultural diversity are inextricably linked. The conservation of nature and biodiversity requires the conservation of human communities. And it's in the spirit of that biocultural approach that we developed IRI, which is what we call the Indigenous Reciprocity Initiative, because it's so many syllables. But IRI is a community-led program consisting of indigenous and local organizations that are engaged in different projects involving food and water security, agroforestry, environmental health, land rights, economic and educational support. And each of the crises that these distinct groups are confronting are all connected by this cultural and economic system that seeks to alienate us from ourselves, from each other, from the sources of everything that we depend on, and commodifies all of the resources of our outer and now inner worlds. And speaking of that system, I live in Washington, D.C., which is sitting on the Potomac River. It's at the northern edge of what was called the Powhatan Nation. This was a confederation of Algonquin-speaking communities that stretched from the Potomac in the north down to the James River, also called the Powhatan River in the south. And it's part of a drainage basin that's formed by the Appalachian Mountains on the west. And so this is a huge watershed. It's an important organ of the earth, and part of ethnobotany is framing things and orienting things in their geographical, historical, cultural, and ecological context. And I think orientation is really important for the perspective that I want to get across today. So right now we're sitting at the base of the Sierra Madre Oriental and the Sierra Madre Occidental. So we're sitting in a basin in a land that was shaped by the traditional ecological practices of pre-Hispanic inhabitants. And these mountains themselves are actually pretty young compared to the Appalachian Mountains, which are already ancient 400 million years ago, before the Atlantic Ocean existed. And In 2014, I traveled from the rainforests of Appalachia down to Ecuador, where I took this photo, and I studied at an ecological reserve and began, working on what would eventually bring me here 8 years later, collaborating with community organizations to try and decolonize philanthropy, but also plant conservation and indigenous advocacy. So, as I mentioned before, this is Erie. This is a grassroots resource with the primary goal of supporting the autonomy of indigenous and local people. So the connecting thread is that each project is self-determined by local people. It's designed and implemented by indigenous communities to meet their own needs and priorities, and it's not imposed from the outside. And another unique element is that the funding is unconditional. So much of the philosophy behind this initiative is informed by the idea that cultural conditioning, religious and cosmological concepts, deeply held unconscious beliefs about reality, which I encompass under the term ontology. So as distinct from epistemology, which is about knowledge production, ontology is about your sense of reality itself and what exists, and it's often unconscious. So, the supposedly secular and objective scientific approaches, there is an ontological perspective that underlies them and affects the nature of our scientific approaches. And I want to ask, what can we learn from other alternative ontologies that can inform a different sense of relationships? Nick touched on this in his talk about a relational perspective. And in the study of ecology, you study relationships. So ecology comes from the Greek word oikos, which means house or home, and it's the study of the relationships between living organisms. So before we can address ecological crises, we really have to understand what those relationships are and orient ourselves within that system of relationship. So what is the story, or what's the ontological framework that we are operating under that gives us our orientation and identity and determines all our relationships? So this story that we're all separate selves programmed by our genes, to achieve reproductive fitness, born in a deterministic world of nature that exists outside of ourselves and has no agency. This is not a sustainable point of view, and it's not really scientific. It's more of a cultural story. And my research has really brought me into contact with alternatives to that hegemonic viewpoint, where I'm invited to enter a story or an ontology where life is always communicating with us, and our well-being is intimately connected to that of every other human being, of every organism and organ of the planet. And I wanted to really find out what can we learn from indigenous stories of relationship that are so profoundly different from the story of alienation that's been established in the shadow of colonialism, of global capitalism, of the dominant cultural and economic system. And what is the ontology that science unconsciously operates under? Because the answer to that is really what determines the nature of all of our relationships. It's the reciprocity, this concept, is something that can only take place within a system of relationship between beings who recognize each other as subjects with agency. So how do we see others, but also how not only other human beings, but other organisms and trees, forests, fungi, animals, rivers, organic compounds, and then how do they see us? There's a story from an ethnography called How Forests Think by anthropologist Eduardo Cohn that he tells of this trip on a hunting party with the Avila Runa in Ecuador, where they told him that it was really important that he sleeps face up at night, because when you're camping in the forest, if a were-jaguar happens upon you while you're asleep and they see a face looking back at them, they recognize you as a subject, a person capable of looking back as self, like themselves, and then they will leave you alone. So for the Runa, how other kinds of beings see us is important. And then the fact that other kinds of beings are seeing us and recognizing us challenges that division between nature and culture that we're conditioned to accept by this dominant form of thinking, this dominant ontology that we are all living in. And if we're forced to recognize that seeing and representing and knowing and thinking are not exclusive to human beings, then this colonial story starts to fall apart a little bit. So this is an example of decolonization. This points to the connection between our relationship to nature and the world, and then how it relates to ideas of conservation. So there's a perspective shifting value of psychedelic plants or visionary experiences. And then there are these stories and these ontologies that seem to be informed by that type of experience. And it seems to question this nature culture dichotomy. So instead, it treats the environment as a network of subjective selves with agency with which we are always relating. And in many indigenous ontologies, like that story of the jaguar, but also even the forest itself can be seen as a thinking being, a network of selves with its own thoughts, with whom we're in constant communication. All living beings are persons and subjects with agency, and even things that we wouldn't consider living beings, like stones and mountains and rivers. And the same scientific perspective of the global north, or what Mauro Almeida, a Brazilian anthropologist, refers to as a monetary ontology. This ontology is reaping the benefits of the ethnopharmacological discoveries generated by indigenous people, but at the same time dismisses that indigenous ontological perspective as unscientific. So this is a contradiction that really results in the degradation of forests and communities by the same forces that are profiting from them or extracting capital from them. And I think that leaving behind this nature and culture dichotomy and engaging with a story or an ontology that views forests as living and thinking networks, that sees all beings as subjects with their own minds and agency, is really, it sounds like a psychedelic point of view, but it's actually backed up by some empirical data, and it recognizes indigenous autonomy, and it ensures the protection of valuable resources of biocultural diversity, of ecological knowledge, and then it's really what allows for something like reciprocity to take place. So this is a picture of Don Ricardo. He's an indigenous Yanesha elder in the community of Sachopen in central Peru, and he was one of my key interlocutors and great friends during my graduate fieldwork. And the first time I interviewed Don Ricardo, I remember him inviting me into his office, which was this patch of dirt next to his herb garden and his chili pepper field. And we were sitting on some wooden stools that he had built underneath some ocumanos. Across the road, there was an avocado stand where we had harvested avocados. And he was always teasing me, saying that he would charge 100 soles per hour for the interview. And he was always joking around. But at one point, when we were deep in conversation, he stopped. We were interrupted by this chorus of citizen birds above us. And he immediately paused and he pointed it out and he said, "Listen to the little parrots. It's not always like this. It's not so common. It means this is a good moment." And he said they only sing that way sometimes, so you don't always see them around. And in his 70s, Ricardo remembers when that birdsong was probably more common. Over the decades, he lived through the deforestation of the Chorobamba River Valley, where this scene unfolded, and he experienced directly religious persecution from Franciscan missions, missionary schools, displacement from colonos, ongoing violence and discrimination. But he welcomed me with open arms, and whether he was in his, harvesting coffee, which he was still doing in his 70s, and with his wife, and I offered to help carry a huge sack of coffee one time, and I remember it was more like a favor that he was doing to me to let me carry it up the hill. But he was always, whether he was in this garden or his office or he was watching a boxing match, he was always listening. He was always in communication with the forest, which is speaking to us whether we are hearing it or not. And I think that this speaks to some revelations within the modern field of ecology, hinting at these concepts that have been long embedded in traditional ecological knowledge. So in the Amazonian context, like in that story of the jaguar, or in Don Ricardo's communication with the parrots in his garden, there's a hint at this world that's been known to ethnographers like Eduardo Viveros de Castro, who coined this term Amerindian perspectivism to describe ontologies that view all of nature as an ecology of subjective selves, seeing subjective identities in all of nature. And these are also related to the ontological turn. So this is a movement in social science that seeks to center this difference in ontological perspective, as well as something called multi-species ethnography, or anthropology beyond the human. And going beyond the human is really a reorganization of this subject-object nature-culture dichotomy, and this idea of forests as living and thinking networks, as of nature itself as being minded or being mind manifesting. This is actually backed up by all of the most recent data on trees and plants, which store information and learn and plan and respond to events around them and communicate with each other, with other organisms. And it shows that the interpretation and use of signs which hold meaning is not exclusive to human beings, and it's not even exclusive to animals. And this could be called a psychedelic view of nature, but it can be directly applied to science and all the colonial legacies of philanthropy, for example. So despite this growing body of empirical evidence, there's still this fundamental contradiction at the heart of biomedicine, and the sources of funding that fuel conservation. So we benefit from these medical advancements based on recipes from Amazonian indigenous origins. Over 75% of pharmaceuticals with plant-based origins come from indigenous communities. This is a picture of D-tubocurarine, which was extracted or isolated from curare, South American arrow poison, and it revolutionized our understanding of neuromuscular function. It wasn't only revolutionary for surgery, but we learned about acetylcholine receptors from this drug. And there have been attempts to address this disparity using intellectual property laws primarily, as established by the CBD. It's not the CBD that you might know, but it's the Convention on Biological Diversity, which took place in 1992 in Rio, and the Nagoya Protocol, which was meant to be the legal framework for enforcing that, which was signed in 2010 by a lot of countries, but not by the United States. And in most cases, these frameworks don't really protect. They've been a failure since they've started working 30 years ago. They don't protect the cultural and environmental resources of indigenous people from extraction and exploitation. These ideas of access and benefit sharing really have more often been the language of biopiracy in the 21st century. So they still represent this same for-profit model that establishes exclusive access and control over certain genetic resources. And I think it's a little bit discouraging to see the psychedelic renaissance kind of latch on to these ideas as the solution to something rather than alternatives like liberatory licenses or IP commons or something that's open source, which would protect indigenous resources from being patented by private entities, but it would not secure them for the use of private entities, or it wouldn't work to protect corporate interests in the same way. So, these models tend to reproduce the same disparities and power imbalances over and over, and they cannot really be the basis for any indigenous advocacy that really reflects an intersectional understanding of these issues or challenges any of these colonial structures. So I think one of the causes for this dissonance is the story offered for how indigenous peoples have come up with these intensely complex preparations. So the explanation is trial and error, but it's really unsatisfactory when you consider curare, for example, takes 72 hours to produce. You have to boil it for that amount of time and also avoid the fragrant and deadly vapors that are emitted. And then it produces a paste which is completely safe to eat, but is, paralyzes when injected. And then it's not a statistically sound explanation either when you consider over 100,000 rainforest taxa and the complex preparation of ayahuasca, for example, and the complex mechanism. And if you ask Shipibo and Ashaninka shamans or other practitioners, how did they come up with this? The answer is often attributed to the plants themselves. So being taught directly by interaction with these other beings. And simply explaining it as something that was accidentally stumbled upon is something that belies a much greater story, and it functions as an excuse for biopiracy. It treats indigenous people as part of nature, something to just be extracted from. And it leads to the mismanagement of forest resources and the devaluation of indigenous knowledge. So
you have 3 minutes.
Three. Okay. All right. So ontology's contribution to science is not just medicinal knowledge, but also ecological knowledge. So there's a global correlation between traditional societies and biodiversity hotspots. And it shows that these are empirically effective management strategies, and these are empirically effective medicinal substances. And they come from this ontology that allows for thinking forests, for non-human intelligence, even at the level of organic compounds. And it runs counter to this dominant ontology. So even though biomedicine recognizes and exploits that objective knowledge, it doesn't recognize those experiences as a source of objective knowledge. So there's a cognitive dissonance that comes from that. And it seems that the treatment of plants and other beings as subjects, this ontology that's shaped by different human-environment relationships, seems to have a positive effect on biodiversity, but it's important not to misrepresent indigenous people as perfect conservationists living in harmony with nature. There's an ethical danger in expecting indigenous people to provide the solutions for the ecological crises that industrialized nations created while bearing the brunt of the consequences. So this is Don Ricardo's son-in-law, Eduardo, showing off his organic coffee, which he's very proud of. But he also leads traditional dance and song in Yanesha. And, he's very interested in recovering, lost varieties of yucca, for example, which the Yanesha used to have 700 cultivars of. And now there's only 4 or 5 that you can find in most people's gardens. But as their land availability shrinks, it has to be dedicated to coffee and cash crops. And so rather than having this oversimplified view of indigenous people, or even of reducing nature to this dichotomy of subject and object, there's a distributed intelligence in thinking forests that's much more applicable to ecological crises and applies to this biocultural approach. So I want to make sure that I get to the end here before I run out of time. So Chacruna launched the Indigenous Reciprocity Initiative of the Americas in April of 2021, and this is a community-directed biocultural conservation program that's connecting directly with grassroots indigenous organizations at the local level with the aim of giving back to the cultural regions that support indigenous plant use and knowledge. So Erie created a pool of funds that supports local and indigenous initiatives, and it's funding with no strings attached. So working with indigenous leadership and prioritizing the autonomy of grassroots initiatives and individuals that are committed to these regions, Erie consists of 20 organizations representing 38 different indigenous groups, and it promotes community-led projects that are designed and implemented by local people to address their own self-determined needs. And Erie recognizes that a ground-up structure that emphasizes local agency, that challenges conventional philanthropic models, is the most meaningful way to support indigenous and local community autonomy, and it's the most effective way to also support biodiversity. So I am co-authored with my former dissertation supervisor, Daniela Peluso, who has been an amazing teacher to me in many ways, and I'm going to end with a quote that she wrote when we co-authored a paper, and I wish that she was here with us, but I'll end with this word from Daniela. If we can recognize and reorient ourselves toward the work of others, rather than to take over the spaces or processes of local peoples, then we stand a better chance of achieving ecological well-being, a safe and healthy environment for current and future generations of humans and non-humans alike in a diverse biosphere. Then perhaps we can come to see the relational world of diverse beings we inhabit. As we attempt to grapple with this dawning realization, we can move away from cynicism and helplessness and embody reciprocity in all that we do. Thank you.
Thank you very much to all of the speakers of this panel for their presentation. Now we have more than 20 minutes for question and answers. And if you have some questions, yes, please.
Yes, certainly. God, I have to admit, I'm completely kind of alien to this kind of stuff, but I find it absolutely fascinating. I'm really chuffed. Thank you so much for giving these talks. But one thing I started to do know a little bit about is the Mazateca. So I kind of wanted to ask, although I think it kind of extends to what the other speakers were saying as well. So it strikes me that to a certain extent, and I definitely kind of accuse later in here, that in some ways by kind of starting with the story of Blossom, you're kind of you're replicating this idea that effectively, use of magic mushrooms basically essentially starts in the 1950s. But it strikes me that, and I should probably reveal that I'm a historian of Oaxaca. I mean, what kind of fascinates me is what essentially is going on, as far as I can make out, in the 1950s, in the 1940s and the 1950s in the Mazateka is there's a massive coffee explosion, right? Effectively, capitalism walks into the Mazateka. And people like Maria Sabina and the kind of shamanistic, or whatever we like to call it, practices are essentially a reaction. And I don't want to come over to Komarov. I mean, no one wants to go anywhere near Komarov now, but certainly, or Tausig. But to see these kind of shamanistic practices as essentially a reaction to this explosion of capitalism. It strikes me. I also seem to remember that was it 2 years before Wassam and James Moore, CIA chemist, arrive. They murder a bunch of the coffee cooperative people there. So I'm just wondering to what extent, how if we can go back into history and see in actual fact that a lot of this was a kind of reaction to a spiritual reaction to not only the capitalism itself and the way that was kind of affecting society, but also the way that it was affecting the land, it was affecting their relationship to the soil, it was affecting their relationship to the plants. So that's one very quick thing. The other thing that I thought that was quite, I thought no one's really investigated when it comes to the Mazateka was the relationship between the church and these shamanistic practices. And I think the assumption is that these shamanistic practices existed completely separate from the church. But in actual fact, one thing that I did find is the Mazateka has a really fascinating relationship to the Catholic Church, to the extent that the Mazatec curas, during as far back as the 19th century, were liberal curas. The Mazatecs formed really the kind of hit battalion of Benito Juarez and Porfirio Diaz's army, and they were led by the cura, right? So there's a strange kind of Catholicism there that I would not be completely unsurprised was in some way linked to certain shamanistic practices, or maybe the assumption of the Catholic Church and the shamanistic practices into the Catholic Church. So I just thought, as a historian, I found this stuff absolutely fascinating. But also, I just wonder if you could kind of maybe talk a little bit about how central capitalism is to this. And sorry, that was way too long. I do apologize. Sorry.
No.
I can as far as I think to answer the first point about starting with Watson, I think it's something I've struggled with because I think it's hard to find a different. I think it's hard to find a different anecdote from the different parts of
The microphone.
Okay, sorry. It's hard to find a different anecdote from the from this story to really start with. I've considered starting with Shkaf Astora and its natural environment, or starting with the pre-Hispanic context. So I think it's a good point. In this case, I was trying to focus on the naming of this specific plant, and because he was the one who led the collecting expedition, it made the most sense to start with that one, because and also just because he's such a fixture in the historiography, I wanted to be able to sort of expand, and because it's after the 1957 Life magazine article, it sort of, I think, positions him somewhat differently to start at that point. As far as capitalism, it is central to this entire story, the expansion of capitalism. As far as I know, I think that they had begun planting coffee in the late 19th century, and I believe that they had participated in the revolution that brought Porfirio Diaz to power as well, and there had been a significant amount of development in the lowland Mazatec areas. But one thing I would sort of, and maybe I don't know if push back on is the right word for it, but I think that the curanderismo in this context isn't necessarily a reaction to this imposition, but it remained heavily tied up in elite networks of power since the pre-conquest or pre-invasion role of a lot of these visionary plants was wound up in politics, wound up in the distribution of water, wound up in the demonstration of public political authority. As the Inquisition comes in, it has to be drawn into more private spaces, and the names are spoken in different contexts. That's why you have sort of syncretic names that start to predominate. But it continues on. It fuses with Catholicism. I would really love to look at the church. I would be really curious to get your input on that, because I don't know where to go archivally. I've looked a little bit at the Inquisition records, but so Teotitlan del Camino was not there. There wasn't a road built there until I think later. It was probably I'm not sure exactly when it was built, but in like the mid 1830s and 1840s, they still hadn't built a road connecting Teotitlan del Camino to like Tehuacan or to Oaxaca City. And so it was a fairly isolated region. And there was a decree, I think in 1686, granting the Teotitlan authorities to nominate like their own alcaldes for the communities for the that were inaccessible due to the conditions of the roads. But I'd really love to talk about that more. I don't know if you want to also chime in on that.
Yeah, well, I agree that I think it is a contradiction to deconstruct the predominance of Wasson, and you start with Wasson, but I suppose I did so because what I'm interested in is outside representations of Mazatec shamanism, and it kind of doesn't even really begin with Wasson, but this was, the first person to speak to a wider audience, and like I was saying, because the predominance of that is filtered through to the research till today. So yeah, that's why I start with that. But the whole idea of the annotated bibliography is to kind of to decenter Wasson, right?
Why don't you explain what is this? Maybe you can give ideas.
With the SIL, right? There's that.
It's
Summer linguistics.
Well, the annotated. Well, I talked about the annotated bibliography, right?
Because the Summer Linguistic Institute is there before Wasson.
The Summer Institute of Linguistics was there before Wasson, and actually was important in introducing Wasson to certain curanderos. And actually, Maria Sabina wasn't the first curandera that Wasson met with. And with the Summer Institute of Linguistics, it's quite interesting because they were the first to write the Spanish language Bible in the Mazatec language. And it was quite interesting because it came to be almost like a competing ritual text with like the divine speech associated with mushrooms. So there's some really interesting stories about this, and people would treat the divine text of the Mazatec language Bible in the same way they would approach the ritual speech of Velades. So they would, for example, some people would be reluctant to read the Bible because they would think they would have to observe the same dieta, the same kind of restrictions before even reading it. So that was often a reason why people, stayed away from the Bible. And I understand that the Summer Institute of Linguistics as well was kind of they were kind of against the mushrooms, and for them the mushrooms were competing with their kind of secularizing missionary practices. That's quite interesting. And about the coffee, like I think it's inevitable that the shamanic practices at the time responded to that. But I think, it didn't start there either. I think inherently Mazatec shamanism has always been about mediating with the outside and the idea of power. So I think it would be a really great avenue to explore, because I often think that it doesn't make sense to look just at the psychedelics. You need to look at this wider context, and I think different commerce around coffee would be really interesting. And also this binary between coffee is kind of like and sugarcane and stuff are very profane plants next to sacred plants. And sometimes with this commerce and commercialization of Salvia Divinorum, this boundary is getting a bit blurrier. So this is quite interesting.
Thank you very much for your answer. We will move forward with a question of our partner in Zoom. Please, Ian Smith, please.
Ian Smith, thank you. I'm a psychiatrist in Scotland. There's very much a psychedelic renaissance. Imperial College London looking at the use of drugs like psilocybin for psychological psychiatric therapy. But however, we know in psychiatry we use these drugs in the 1950s and 60s, and whilst they undoubtedly did some good, they also brought some harm. Danish patients, for example, being compensated for adverse effects of LSD. So I think my question is, in these indigenous communities, are there any casualties for the use of Salvia divinorum, the use of magic mushrooms, psilocybin. You know, every drug has its benefits, but also its risks. So are there any negative consequences in these indigenous communities? I think certainly in Western medicine, when they were used previously, there were casualties. Thank you.
Please, for the speakers.
Well, I haven't ever. I don't think there's been any. You know, what you can't overdose on psilocybin, right? But I think there's lots of cautionary tales around people, kind of fatalities associated with not respecting the kind of reciprocal relations which are inherent to consuming these plants and fungi. And I've heard of people. There's lots of tales of people, you know, going mad, going missing, you know, yeah, and ultimately dying, but nothing related to kind of like pharmacological activity. No.
Joseph, do you want to add something?
Yeah, I can add that as far as I know, no one has overdosed on Salvia divinorum, on Salvinorin A. It is a kappa opioid receptor agonist, so I'm sure there could be some kind of, but kappa opioids are anti-addictive, are relatively anti-addictive compared to the mu opioid receptor. The other aspect, also there could be the aspect of like, not all shamanism necessarily is benign and sort of like what we want to imagine is like the kind of like benevolent curandero who was like, you know, in harmony with nature and has no kind of like class or power interests. Because a lot of the times it is bound up in like politics and warfare, and so there is like the use of visionary plants like Strauss pastora or like psilocybe mushrooms for warfare or for like assault shamanism.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Joseph, do you want to add something?
Sure. I guess I would just want to add that I think, in my experience, the casualties that I've come in contact with have been not a result of the plants or the compounds, but really the culture around them. So in the community where I worked in Sacho-Pen, the last living curandero had been killed, you know, probably like 30 or 40 years before I arrived, because of fears around sorcery. And there was even a huge ceiba tree that used to be in the community, but it was seen to be a source of kind of evil energy or evil spirits by the more Christian members of the community. And that kind of thing is actually starting to change. And although they don't use ayahuasca in Sacho-Pen, they sing a song about it, and they have a big ceiba tree that is now seen in a more positive view. And yeah, I think it's really the market of the psychedelic renaissance and the resulting economic activity that's bringing harm to the communities rather than the plants.
Thank you very much, Joseph. We have another question. Okay, yeah, please, you, and then
Okay.
Richard Del Rio, please.
I love the online people, but
Yeah.
I'm really anxious to ask you this question because it's very practical. I teach a really popular drugs history class, and I feel like my students have gotten way ahead of me in terms of this psychedelic revolution, and so I've had to do a lot of reading and things to catch up with them. But I'm so struck by the Fungi Academy and how just disturbing it looks to me, but yet how appealing it could be to a very young, impressionable, progressive American college students. So my question to the three of you is, to Joseph, Nick, and Patrick, what could I say? Where should I direct my students? They're very excited by Michael Pollan. I'm not really wanting to assign that. I'm just wondering when they talk about like the healing properties, like should I alert them to share your institute, warn them about the Fungi Academy? Like I don't want, these are kids who are progressive and liberal and don't want to engage in, you know, things that are destructive. And I feel like some of this, it really verges on at least what Patrick was talking about is potentially really destructive and
Thank you very
irresponsible
much.
as a citizen, you know, as a human on the planet.
Patrick, you have anything to add to this debate, to this discussion regarding the three questions that our partners share with us?
Yeah, I would say in response to specifically the last question, I think, I went there as a young person and I encountered the communities in San Marcos, and I was won over and I thought it was really intriguing. I mean, I always felt like it was a shoe that never really fit on me personally. But I think in terms of talking to students about it, it's not to downplay its relevance or its attractiveness, but instead to ask questions about why, right? And I think if you were to ask, I think probably there's some idea that there's an affinity with local cultures or there's a greater sense of connection to nature. And, that there are lots of sources for that in Guatemala, in Mexico, and other places. There are actual people who work with nutritional medicines. It's just that the journey to use those medicines, as maybe this answers the earlier question, is often, a process of building a relationship, a process of trust. And the notion that you can arrive somewhere with money and engage in a spiritual trip that's transformative for you and meaningful for the place that you're at, I think is ultimately, without undermining the potential therapeutic benefits for people, right? And certainly I didn't mean to kind of suggest that Cybin and Compass Pathways are pursuing the right and noble path. There's issues with that too. It's that I think it's around something we talk about a lot in Canada about right relationships, restoring right relationships, and thinking about how we can engage with communities in a way that supports them and what they want, so that we can see that these artificial communities of expats that are created, that are sort of talking about creating a more harmonious relationship with nature, or reimagining Indigenous traditions for the modern age, are really taking away power and authority from, and voice most of all, from Indigenous communities who more than ever need those voices to be amplified. And that's a role that youth can play by using social media and other means to amplify already existing movements. And I didn't get a chance to talk about it because time ran out, but some of the images that I showed were from local communities organizing to reforest, organizing to right the wrongs done by industrial expansion. As there are also communities around Lagoatitlan who are trying to introduce terracing projects that are callback to previous generations. So for youth that really want to engage and they're really excited about spiritual dimensions of psychedelics, I think maybe have a conversation about, that all of these plant medicines, to my knowledge, and I don't profess to be an expert, almost all of them are taken in the context of a relationship. So you think about a sweat in Canada.
Thank you very much, Patrick. We have 10 seconds. Only time to Richard make the last question, and I can make a commitment in the name of all the speakers of this table in order to answer the last question. Please make your question, Richard.
So my question is not so much a question as maybe a cautionary comment. In regard to Ian's question about casualties, I noticed that the panel, almost the whole panel, responded in terms of overdoses. And I think if the pandemic has taught me anything, right, is that we can't just measure things in terms of death, right, because that's kind of simplifies problems, overly simplifies them. So I would just say to think about it in terms of what the casualty could be is not necessarily just someone overdosing and dying, but what kind of impacts it had on the social relationships between the people that they live with, their employment, these kind of effects that, for example, could be at risk if someone were to engage in this too much, right? Or not respect the plant or not respect the compound. And that's all, cautionary comment. Thank you very much for the panel.
Thank you very much, Richard. And we have the record, and we are taking notes. And if possible, we will answer to you. Thank you very much, Patrick, to join us from a distant land. And thank you very much for all the speakers and all the publics. I have my list of topics pending here. We don't have enough time. Thank you very much to join this panel, Decolonizing Psychedelics, and have a good day, and share with us the next keynote, please.